They have chosen our next king. The villagers leaned forward, eager to hear the decision. Some held their breath in anticipation. The gods have chosen Prince Dyke as the next king of this great kingdom, the priest declared. The crowd erupted in cheers and shouts of joy. Long live the king! Long live King Dyke, they chanted. In the midst of the celebration, Prince Chuki stood quietly. He didn't seem to care about losing the throne. Instead, his eyes were filled with sadness as he thought about his brother Ioka, who had been buried alive for a crime he didn't commit. The chief priest took the royal beads and placed them around Prince Dyke's neck, then carefully set the crown on Dyke's head. Bow before your new king, the priest commanded. Everyone in the crowd immediately bowed down, repeating, King Dyke, King Dyke. After the ceremony, a great feast began. Food and drink were served to everyone. The villagers ate, drank, and celebrated late into the night. This is the best palm wine I've ever tasted, one man exclaimed. And the food. I've never eaten so well in my life, another agreed. As the celebration wound down and people started to head home, Mr. Okoro approached the new king. Your Highness, he said with a sly smile, may I have a word? King Dyke nodded, and they moved to a quiet corner. You saw how smoothly everything went, Mr. Okoro said. Our plan worked perfectly. Now that you're king, I hope you haven't forgotten our arrangement. King Dyke smiled confidently. Don't worry, Mr. Okoro. You've proven yourself a wise and loyal friend. I won't forget what you've done for me. Come back tomorrow, and we'll discuss how I'll repay your favor. Mr. Okoro bowed deeply. Thank you, Your Highness. I look forward to our continued partnership. As Mr. Okoro left, King Dyke looked out over his kingdom, a satisfied smile on his face. He had achieved his goal, but little did he know that his troubles were far from over. That night, Prince Chuki sat in his hut, his heart heavy with grief. He couldn't stop thinking about his family. They're all gone, he whispered to himself. Mom, Dad, Ioka. I'm all alone now. He looked around the room, tears in his eyes. I can't stay here anymore, he decided. There's nothing left for me in this village. Quietly, Chuki packed a small bag with some clothes and food. As he prepared to leave, he knelt down and spoke to the sky. Gods of our ancestors, he prayed, his voice shaking with emotion, please hear me. My family has been taken from me unjustly. I beg you, bring vengeance upon those responsible for their deaths. With one last look at his home, Chuki slipped out of the village under the cover of darkness. Just as he disappeared into the forest, a strange wind began to blow through Umo. It started softly but quickly grew stronger, rattling doors and windows. Suddenly, at the spot where Prince Ioka had been buried alive, the ground began to move. A ghostly figure rose from the earth. It was Ioka's spirit. The ghost looked around, its eyes filled with anger. It began to walk through the village, passing through walls and closed doors. One villager, awakened by the wind, saw the ghost and screamed, "It's Prince Ioka," she cried. "His spirit has returned." But before anyone else could see, the ghost vanished into thin air, leaving behind a village filled with fear and confusion. The next day, the village elders gathered at the palace for King Dyke's first official speech. The air was tense with anticipation as the new king stepped forward. King Dyke cleared his throat and began, "My dear elders and people of Umo, I am deeply honored that the gods have chosen me as your new king. I promise to rule with greatness and nobility. I will never fail you, my people." The elders nodded approvingly. Elder Nosu stood up, his old bones creaking. "May the gods bless your reign, King Dyke. Lead us with wisdom." Other elders echoed similar sentiments, blessing the new king. Then King Dyke raised his hand for silence. "I have an important announcement," he said. I am appointing Mr. Okoro as my personal advisor and assistant. He will oversee all village matters. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mr. Okoro stepped forward, feigning surprise. My king, I am honored. I will serve you and our village faithfully. As the meeting continued, King Dyke felt a surge of satisfaction. He had the power he'd always wanted, little did he know what was coming. Suddenly, 2 villagers burst into the palace, panting heavily, their faces pale with fear. Elder Adabo stood up, alarmed. What's wrong? Why are you breathing so hard? One of the villagers, a young man named Chidi, spoke between gasps. My king, may you live long. We went to fetch water from the river, but what? King Dyke demanded, irritation clear in his voice. Speak up. The other villager, an older woman named Adana, cried out, our rivers. They've turned to blood, completely. A shocked silence fell over the room. Then King Dyke laughed nervously. What nonsense is this? Rivers turning to blood. Impossible. It's true, my king, Chidi insisted. We saw it with our own eyes, just this morning. Elder Wosu leaned forward, his face grave. This is a serious claim. We must investigate immediately. King Dyke stood up, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. Unless I see this with my own eyes, I refuse to believe it. This is absurd. Mr. Okoro stepped forward, trying to calm the situation. My king, perhaps we should send a group to check the river. If it's true, we need to know. King Dyke nodded reluctantly. Very well. We will go to the river at once. If this is some kind of joke, there will be severe consequences. As they prepared to leave, the palace buzzed with worried whispers. What could this mean? Was it an omen? The new king's reign was off to a troubling start, and the worst was yet to come. King Dyke, accompanied by 3 guards and several elders, made their way to the river. As they approached, an eerie silence fell over the group. It can't be true, muttered Elder Wosu. Rivers don't just turn to blood. But when they reached the riverbank, they froze in shock. The water was indeed a deep, dark red, thick and viscous like blood. By the gods, exclaimed King Dyke, his face pale. What sorcery is this? Elder Adabo stepped closer to the river, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch the red liquid. It's warm, he said, pulling his hand back quickly, like fresh blood. King Dyke paced back and forth, his mind racing. This is really strange. I am so confused. What do we do now? What exactly do we do now? He shouted, panic rising in his voice. One of the king's advisors spoke up, Your Highness, perhaps we should inform the chief priest immediately. He might have a solution or at least an explanation for this. King Dyke nodded, grasping at any potential solution. Yes, good idea. You two, he pointed at 2 of his guards, go to the chief priest right away. Tell him what's happened and bring him here immediately. The guards bowed and set off quickly. King Dyke and the rest of the group headed back to the palace, their minds troubled by what they had seen. As they waited for the guards to return with the chief priest, time seemed to crawl by. King Dyke fidgeted on his throne, growing more anxious by the minute. What's taking them so long? He muttered. After what felt like hours, he stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. I'm sending 2 more guards to find out what's keeping them. He called 2 more guards.